we all know Gordon Tuthill is a surveyor and a historian, and he's going to present his research on Bridgewater's unique land division. We also have a special guest.
John Bruno.
Excuse me?
John Bruno.
Sorry, John Bruno brought us his transit. How can I forget his name? He surveyed our property. Anyway, he brought a transit that Gordon had told him. So we have an antique transit to view and a chain, and I can't imagine lugging that chain through the woods. So it's nice to see the real equipment and the work it took to survey those lands. So without further ado, I'll ask Gordon to come up and tell us all about it. Thank you.
Well, I hardly know where to start. I thank you all for coming. Number one, I want to thank Sue Chancellor for making this all possible. I could not possibly have done it without her. And thinking back over the years, you know, where this all started. It was 60 years ago, February in 1958, that I first started my research in this very room. And it was a very cold winter days that I was working here. The land records were all stored in that vault. And Mrs. Cram was a town clerk and took 2 or 3 of her books over to her house, which is right across the street here. I would have to start a fire and go to work in here. And it was so cold, the books were so cold that the skin actually came off my fingers that winter, like snake skin. I was working for the Grashow Engineering Company at the time, so I think he was subcontracting. They were settling Percy Salter's estate, which was a very large estate. And the surveyor wanted information when they were breaking it down, and that's how I happened to get involved with it. There's been a lot of water over the dam since then. I've had a lot of people, many young women actually, that did research for me. I always had a research project ahead. And Lisa LeBaron, right out of her graduated from high school, came in and wanted a little survey project. And I gave her a project here in Bridgewater, and she really got hung up on it. She discovered an 1808 tax report that listed all of the people and their joiners. And as she searched back, she found these surveys, and they were very simple, plain geometry. She was drawing them up, and they named 1 or 2 joiners. And Lisa saw that as a puzzle, and she worked on it long after she got through for me. She was just fascinated by it, but it got me going too, because I could see the possibility of making a map of Bridgewater of 1808. So now to get on with the story, Bridgewater started like more than half of the towns in the state of Vermont with that Wentworth Charter. And I think most of you are probably pretty familiar with the charter, but this charter was a little different. It named Oliver Willard to be the moderator. Now, Oliver Willard, it may not have been the same Oliver Willard that was involved and took over Woodstock. There were 6 different Oliver Willards. The one that took over Woodstock is buried in Heartland, and his nephew is actually buried in Woodstock. So there are 2 Oliver Willards, but they're not father and son. The charter set aside 1,040 acres for allowance land for highways and wasteland. That 1,040 acres represents roughly 5% of the land area in the town. That immediately clouds all of the titles, all the land titles. It put a cloud on it, because roughly 5% of this land was never conveyed to anybody. And then, in order to get the grant, of course it was done by speculators, and probably 3 or 4 of them. In order to get the grant, they have to have 60 or more signatures on the petition for the grant. if you can think about that for just a second here, if two or three or four of you wanted to get a grant of a town, and you know you've got to get 60 signatures on the document, think about how you're going to go about getting them. But they did. As soon as the grant was made and the charter came back, it had the map on the back of it. And now these petitioners are now proprietors. They're non-resident landowners and owning this land in common. The charter said they had to divide that up among themselves into shares. Okay, the map, the shares, the map. I had a document here to talk about the 61 grantees, but I'm going to go directly to this. This is my idea of the original lotting of Bridgewater. There were 61 proprietors and the 4 public shares and the governor's 500 acres. Now, I goofed on that because when I worked this out, there was 1 extra share, and I gave it to the governor up there in the right-hand corner, and that was a mistake because he didn't actually get that land that way. This was probably drawn right up shortly after they got the charter and done right at one of their very first meetings. They made this division, and then they sent the surveyor up here to lay it out. The only record I have of the surveyors is in Killington, and it's a very detailed report of how he came up here in February and March and laid out the town of Killington. So there are many different subdivisions of lotting maps that are done different ways. This was my idea of it, and the first thing the surveyor did when he came up here, he took this long beam compass and ran a baseline, and that would be the extreme south end with the numbers on it, 1 through, that would be a baseline. As soon as that was run, then the chainman would come in and they would chain over the distance. This was all figured, and I don't have those numbers, but they would chain over to the first range line, and then the person running the compass would take the bearing. It was the same as the town line, north 32 east, and he'd just go right through, and he marked that range line very well. Over the years and the work I've done, those range lines have held up extremely well in any town I've worked in. And so then while he was doing that, they would chain over the next, across for the next range lines, and he'd do this, he'd probably come back and run the same thing. After that was done, he would go back over and start chaining up for the lot lines. As he crossed his range lines, he probably marked close to the corners, but that wasn't always very well done. I don't think they certainly didn't take the time to set proper corners on those lot corners. And they probably scribed in the number of the lot, and there were 2 ways of numbering those, and one was to number the lots individually by there in that southeast corner I've shown one. They were described by lot and range, lot number 2 and range number 3 or what have you. Another system was simply to number the lots, and I'll show you an example of that shortly. I say the range lines have held up very well. The lot lines got corrupted fairly early. We do not have the original proprietor's record of the drawing of the lots. And again, that drawing was probably done before any surveyors came up here. They put these numbers in a hat, and they drew the numbers, 1, 2, 3, and I'll show you an example of that in a second, how they did that. And I have not been able to find any survey description of any of these lots. But there were 204 lots. And the thing, with this configuration, I wound up with that one extra share of 300 acres. And see, I gave it to the governor, and that wasn't right. Then the next slide. This was a communication I had from a lawyer in Rutland. And in 1989, Porter Noble sent me this along with some other information and looking for ideas about how to present this information. And I'll read from that document. It says a charter mandated that the town be divided into equal shares among the proprietors. The lease lots were to each have a share. Each share contained slightly more than 300 acres. Now that's true here. Each share was a little more than 300 acres. And then he shows how that one was lotted, that was numbered. And that numbering system is almost identical to the numbering systems in Killington. Each share was divided into 3 lots of equal size containing 100 acres each. Each lot was given a number. Each number was put on a slip of paper and put in a hat or basket. Each proprietor then drew 3 numbers that would determine where his land was located. And then under that he shows what you would find in the proprietor's record of what they drew. And those numbers would be 1, 2, 3, and they were called the first, second, and third division. And those first, second, and third divisions are done quite differently in different towns. But the point is that there were 3 divisions among the proprietors. And again, he showed the college rights had lot 68, 117, and 51. They're scattered all over town. One of the reasons for that was that these were speculators. They wanted to spread their land around so they'd have a good lot and a bad lot, and it would be much easier to sell 100 acres than it would to sell 300 acres. There's a pretty good chance that their surveyor gave a report of what he found on some of the areas. I know in Killington, the surveyor was instructed to keep his eyes open for water power and arable land. And in his report, he stated where he found the water power and so on and so forth, and the animal tracks that he saw. It's a very detailed report, and it's the only one I've ever seen. Now, Porter Noble also used the USGS sheet, the topographic map. And he said the USGS map is made up of layers of information shown in graphic form, contour lines, roads, streams, and so on and so forth. Each is a separate layer, and the straight dashed lines represent stone walls. Many of these stone walls were laid along the original surveyor's lot lines. Now, most of those stone walls actually were on the range lines. There were some exceptions, and I'll show you one in a second here. And I think we can do that in the USGS sheet. This is the west side of town. It's next to the, well, I show you there where Daly Hollow is. And the heavy black line is the Sherburne Parker's Gore. But you can see that long red line. That was a range line. And then I scale that, and it scales 160 rods more or less from the town line to the range line. So that was it was just scaled at 160 rods, and we'll see what happens later on relative to that. These lot lines look a little more perpendicular on here than they did when I showed them, but they were perpendicular to the range line. And again, that goes back to the original lotting to simplify things. I don't know just the acreage in that, but in doing the surveys, this is a tremendous help because the surveys generally would describe as starting on at the town line and then going over 160 rods in the range line. So if I were to look at this and know the present day landowner, I could trace that right back to this lot and these stone walls. Now the stone walls probably belonged to the person that owned the land. He would lay the stone walls just outside of his boundary line, or inside of his boundary lines. So he would own the stone walls. That was done probably around 1763 that they got their lots. They knew what they had. 1764, the king declared the west bank of the Connecticut to be the boundary. Now we're in the province of New York. New York did not recognize these titles. So here these people are holding the bag, so to speak, with nothing. Now I have to back up for a second because after this survey was done, that cost them some money. So whoever paid for it goes back to collect from the proprietors. Well, the proprietors were happy to sign the petition, but they weren't happy to pay part of the cost of surveying. So many of them just forfeited the land, and others transferred their share to another one of the proprietors. So eventually, there were probably 6 or 8 proprietors that wound up with the whole thing. Then history was kind of lost until 1779, 2 years after the state had declared its independence. And this is a deed to Asa Jones, the first settler in town. And he acquired that in August 14, 1779 from Bildak Eastman. Now I never heard of Bildak Eastman, and he doesn't state where he got it from. But he's in, he's in Westminster, Vermont. And Asa Jones was in Royalston, Massachusetts at the time. They're not far apart. Royalston is right on the New Hampshire border, just a little east of I-91. So Westminster and Royalston were not that far apart. But this deed conveyed a full share, 300 acres, to Asa Jones. And he doesn't state where he got it from, nor does he give any survey description of it. So there it is. Then the next action was in 1781 when the Justice Samuel Emmons of Woodstock called a first meeting of the proprietors of Bridgewater. I have no idea who those proprietors were. And the warning, and we won't go over that, but the warning was for a meeting to be held the 10th of the same month. So on that one, we'll go through the minutes of that meeting and the votes and the names here. And Article 1 was to appoint the moderator, and the moderator was Asa Jones. They appointed John Ransom as a proprietor's clerk. Now, John Ransom was a Woodstock landowner. They appointed Asa Jones a treasurer. They appointed James Cady the tax collector. Now, James Cady was a Woodstock resident, owner. And then they voted to run out the lines of said town. Each proprietor has said right to run out a 100-acre lot, to run out 100-acre lots. Voted $61 for the proprietor's use. Article 8 voted to set town lines and lay out roads and to attest the survey bill of the first pitched lots. Now, this is the first time that the word pitch comes into play, and I don't think anybody has found the definition of pitched. But a lot of these lots were pitched or laid out. Article 8 was to choose Asa Jones, James Cady, and Amos Mondell for said committee to attest those surveys. So they would survey a lot, and then it would go to these commissioners they'd check it out to make sure it was okay, and then there's no deed. It just sat there for a bit. And Article 10, 1/10 of the proprietors, 1/16 of the proprietors could call a meeting. Now, with 61 original proprietors, 1/16 of those would represent about 5 people. In other words, 4 or 5 people could run the whole show. And right here you've only found 4 or 5 names. And none of these names were the original proprietors. They're now called proprietors. They are owners of land in Bridgewater. They're non-resident owner proprietors. Okay, I think we'll go to the surveyors next. Let's skip that one for a minute, Lisa. So after that vote, everything went crazy in Bridgewater. They were surveying right and left. And okay, the next one. This is a combination of work, and it wasn't done overnight. Asa Jones had that middle lot with no survey description of it. I don't have a clue where it is, except for one thing. I know where the stone is, up on the North Bridgewater Road. So Asa Jones was in that location. That's as much as I knew about it. But again, Lisa was putting this together like a puzzle. And I threw away the little papers I had here, but the order of things here. Oh yeah, I've got them now. August 14th, 1779, there was no survey of Asa Jones. I never found any survey of that. And I've broken that down and still haven't found any definition of the east or west lines, any length of that line. In 1785, a deed to William Grow with a survey description. And he got that from September 7th, 1785, from Josiah Dunham and Ichabod Churchill, both of Woodstock. They don't state how they got it, but they did recite a survey description. And they sold it for a sum of 130 pounds. And William Grow was in Pomfret, Vermont at the time. 100 acres of land with a usual allowance for highways. The dimensions of that, it was north, 58 west, 160 rods, which gets right back to the earlier one that I showed you with 160 rods on the west side of town, of the stone walls. And then it was north, 32 east, adjoining the town line at 105 rods. So the survey is for 105 acres. The deed is 100 acres. The deed has a cloud on it, of 5 acres of public land. It can be picked up and used by the selectmen to lay out the highway at any point in time. May 28, 70. Asa sells by survey description, 13.5 acres. He started at the southwest corner, and then he came over a few rods. I don't have those in front of me here. And then he took a bearing up to the road or highway, and I'm not sure which, whether he went to the limits of the highway or the center of the road. And then a distance up to his northwest corner. But he doesn't give any distance on this west line. And then in June 9th, 1785, the proprietors conveyed 5 acres to him to make up for the land they took on the highway. That really wasn't necessary, but apparently they didn't understand that there was already the allowance made there. So they deeded him that little 5-acre strip. And they started at the town line and went north 58 west, 160 rods to his northwest corner. So between those 2 surveys, I've got the length of Asa Jones' property, the east and west lines, the length of those. And May 16th, 1767, was a survey of 32.5 acres by John Palmer. And this is the first time they call the 2nd division of Joseph Burt. How did they know that that was Joseph Burt's? Did they have a map? September 4th, 1788, Amos Mendel laid out 100 acres. And his survey started 11 rods from the southwest corner of Asa Jones. And then he went up 160 rods. And that was on the 1st and 2nd division of the half-right of Samuel McClintock. Now that can kind of foul you up a little bit, you know, thinking about that. How did he know that it was McClintock's? Containing 100 acres and huge allowance for roads. And Amos Mendel was the 2nd settler. January 4, 1794, a survey to Wade Jones. Wade Jones was the son of Asa, and that was a survey description that went out to 180 rods, pretty much the same as John Palmer's, except that his north line only comes to the road and follows down the road to the northwest corner of the widow Jones. So his father had died, and Wade wound up with that piece of land there. After all of that took place, there was a question about the legality of this whole thing, the way they were doing it. And so that was addressed by the state legislature. And we don't need to read that whole thing, but the long and the short of it was that they fully authorized and empowered at any legal meeting by them already warned or to be warned for the purpose to complete the division of the undivided land in said Bridgewater by pitching. It's fine, it's okay. So that is pretty much the end of my story. So now, any questions? Yes. And you'll have to speak up because I'm a little hard of hearing.
So Asa Jones, you said, was the first settler. I wondered, does that mean he lived here? Because you said they were absentee owners.
Asa Jones moved here about a year after he bought the land. And he lived here, and when he sold that little 13-acre piece, he described it as being the northwest corner of the land I now live on. What has happened here, you know, have you ever seen that monument? It's a very nice monument, and there was some time and money put into that, and it's in the wrong place. It's bothered me a little bit, but what difference does it make? You know, who cares? But the other morning I met Phoebe Standish, and Phoebe owned the land just south of that, and there's a town pound right there beside of the road at that intersection of those roads on the south side of it. And Phoebe told me that she had seen a cellar hole on the back side of that pound, the town pound. Now when he deeded that, he made some reservations. And one reason I put that before that, again, you want the green one with, yes, that one. He reserved the right to change the brook, to dig a ditch from the brook over, and he also reserved a spring on that land that he had sold. So I'm inclined to think that that original house was just a little above where Phoebe Standish's house is now on that road. In back of the town pound, it's been bulldozed over, and Phoebe thought that this other hole had been filled in. And so now my next project is to try and run down somebody that might know a little bit more about that and can corroborate what Phoebe told me. The land is cleared, and it certainly looks as though they might have been filled in a cellar hole there. And if that's true, that would have been Asa Jones' first house.
Yeah. Is that right up our road here, Gordon, North Bridgewater?
Yes.
So it's just straight up this road?
Just up the road here ways.
Here.
Right at the intersection of those roads, you'll see that monument.
Yeah, probably goes to North Bridgewater.
And just below that is where Phoebe's house was, and that's quite a nice house. But that's an old house, but I don't know much about that yet. It's certainly not the original house. There was a 1798 federal tax, and I just come into possession of that about 5 or 6 years ago. The historian in Woodstock, and her name escapes me at the moment, came in with a book about so wide and about that thick, very heavy leather binding on it, and she didn't know what it was or where she got it from. It turned out to be the 1798 federal tax of all the land in the country. There were 16 states at the time. That is an extremely rare document. If you go on Google and check, you won't find it anywhere. The state of Vermont didn't know about it. And it listed Asa Jones with a house, but it wasn't taxable. It listed Amos Mendel with a house that was taxed at 0.2% of the listed value. In that report, it's on a kind of a sliding scale, so they didn't tax log cabins. They named them, but they didn't tax them. They didn't tax houses worth less than $100, but then it was a sliding scale, so it went up. The most valuable house in Woodstock was taxed at 0.4%. Most of them were taxed at 0.2%. That report includes 12 towns, and it's called the 4th Collection District in Vermont. It's for a surveyor or anybody that's really doing researching, that is almost invaluable, because it gives you an idea of the amount of land he had, the amount that he had improved. It's a very valuable document. And that has all come into being fairly recently. I don't know quite what more there is to add to this.
I think one thing to remember is that this was really wilderness at that time.
Yes, that's right.
And, getting around was not very easy.
No, but they must have marked those lines extremely well, John,
Right.
because they've held up so well over the years. And then when they're running the lot lines, they probably weren't quite as particular about the corners. They did, once in a while you'll find one where they scribed in the numbers on the trees, but for the most part they didn't. Okay, now we can show a little bit of the monuments that are really a help. This one up on the right-hand corner was when you're researching these deeds and the surveys, some of them talk about stone corners. And anytime I have 2 or 3 that talk about a stone corner, I circled it on my USGS sheet. And that was the case with this particular stone. I had it marked on my USGS sheet. And Harlan Booth came in the office. And he was looking at it. And he said, what's that, So I said, well, Harlan, that's the stone corner of several surveys. And then I went on to say, I think it may be the corner of a school lot that I haven't found a survey for yet. And Harlan said, I always wonder what the S was on that stone. Now, I took this picture, but, you know, that was years ago. And I went up last summer, but I didn't have legs enough to get to it again. The one over on the left-hand side is another picture that Harlan Booth gave me. He took that picture for me, and that's another stone corner of a school lot. But with that kind of information, you can nail those down pretty darn close, the original surveys. The one on the bottom is kind of a typical stake and stones, and a lot of the surveys refer to this as stake and stones. That is pretty typical of a lot of the stone piles that I've found around where they call for stake and stones. That's a pretty typical picture of it.
I have a question about, it seems the stone walls are totally opposite to the property lines. You think when they started building a stone wall, the first thing they'd want to do was to...
Let's back up again on that one with okay, no, that one. That south line on that south lot is a stone wall. I don't know whether you can see it or not. If you look way down on the, yeah, that's a stone wall, but there's another one south of that. I think it showed on.
I think there's a little.
There's another stone wall south of that.
Along the road, right at the bottom of the picture. Right.
Yeah, that's a stone wall. But you notice that's parallel? Those lines are parallel. The landowners didn't build those walls. That wasn't a joint effort. And the other thing is, they would have been careful to build them on their own side of the line. And in all the years that I worked here, I only found one instance where that stone wall was defined, and that was in the town of Stratford, where there was a question about a subdivision. And I found the fence viewer's report. And he's coming down, this is yours, this is his, this is yours, this is his. This stone wall is yours because you built it. Stone walls, in some instances, are pretty valuable. And I think if you keep your eyes open, look around a little bit, you can pretty much determine where the stones came from in that wall, which side of the wall. Yes, John.
Might not some adjoining landowners agree on putting a stone wall someplace, in which case
Over time,
it would go around the middle.
over time, you know, the stone walls are the lines. But the truth of the matter is the line isn't on a stone wall.
I have another question.
And I'll add one more thing to that, John, while I'm on the subject. I fixed a lot of fence in my lifetime. And one of them was my grandfather up in Braintree. His boundary line was on the town line between Randolph and Braintree, and it was a long one. He had two farms that were contiguous. And up over the woods, through the woods, and so on and so forth. I knew my section of fence, and I knew my neighbor's section. Okay, I'm pulling the wire my way, and my neighbor's pulling the line his way. So pretty soon you get this sweeping line. The deed calls for a straight line, but the property owners recognize the boundary line. And thinking more about that, if you really start studying it, you'll find the wire on one side of the trees as you're going. You'll find the wire on the other side of the tree. You can pretty much determine who is fixing what. You know, there's a lot to think about.
This line here, is that defined now by a pair of stone walls, something there, or is that something else? I know there's a lane, what we used to call a lane.
You know, I don't know, John. The only stone walls showing on this topo map are the ones shown, and there are a lot of, as you know, there are a lot of other stone walls in that area. And down further south, about midway down on that Jones land. There's a lot of walls and things in there, the fields, the barns and so on and so forth. But the fact that Asa reserved the right to the spring, which is on the west side of that road, and he reserved the right to build a dam and ditch the brook over onto his land, says to me that there was a reason for that. I think his house was on that side of the road, but I don't know where.
Have you talked with Tom Standish about the location of that cellar hole?
I'm sorry?
Have you talked to Tom?
I haven't talked to Tom. No,
Because
Phoebe
he
was...
mentioned to me once that at a certain time of the year, from that they could see a line, appeared to be a collapsed stone chimney that had tipped over on his property that he believed marked the site of a house, a cabin, maybe associated with this.
Yeah.
But you could only see it when it would snow, just barely, when the snow was just right. But he might be able to help you.
That's my next project, to see if I can't get behind that a little bit, you know, find out a little bit more about it. And also when Phoebe's house was built, because that's very old. And of course when Asa bought a lot of other land, and he sold a lot of land. He had land way over on the west side of town too. I have tried to complete a 1780 layer. I don't think I'm going to live long enough to finish it, but we got a pretty good start on it. And again, Lisa LeBaron did an awful lot of work on that. Another person that has done really some good work, and I bought her work, was Rhonda Pratt. Rhonda was doing some work for her mother up in Bridgewater in the center, and she plotted these surveys and the survey description. Did a really nice job, and I bought all the ones she had from her, and I've got them in my computer. But again, all of that kind of goes together, you know, and you build around it. Up in Bridgewater Hollow, Israel Richardson laid out 300 acres, or only 3 or 4 300 acres laid out, but Israel Richardson laid out one up in Bridgewater Hollow. And the southwest corner of that was west of the falls. And one of the first things Israel Richardson did was sell, or he gave away 50 acres there for a person to get the mill set up. And then, of course, he sold the rest of it. Yeah. But when Israel Richardson's estate was settled, he still had quite a bit of land in Bridgewater. So 1780 was a big year for Woodstock. The town constable was auctioning off the land that the state had taken from Charles Ward Apthorpe, and there was 6,700 acres. 2,700 acres of that land was right on the Bridgewater line, and the constable was auctioning it off between 1800 and 1801. So there was a lot of activity right in that area in 1780.
I was thinking when you was talking about the monument for the first dwelling in Bridgewater, where do you think it should be placed?
That's what I have to research. But if it's where I think it should be, it won't be visible from the road. It'll be down back of the pound. So it's, you know, maybe we shouldn't rock any boats.
I think one of the things that we've always run into as surveyors is that we're now taking new ways of measurement and the accuracies of measurements and trying to superimpose them on the old survey equipment that was used to establish them. So I know in talking to a lot of attorneys and things, when you're talking about boundary disputes and everything else, they just want to go by the distance. They don't care what stone wall is out there or what physical evidence out. They want to go by the distance. But when you actually measure between the physical evidence, it's different from what was in the old deed.
Well, as you know, there are a lot of different ways of measuring and different measuring equipment. One thing I will say is that the highest paid man on those early survey crews was the hinder man. The hinder man was the one that's pulling the train and making sure it's a right angle. he's the most valuable man and the highest paid man on the crew, the hinder man. When I was doing Stratford, the county road and the turnpike are almost the same footprint. I plotted those. They go from one town, a long line down the hills. It fit almost perfectly between the town lines. That measurement was done with extreme care in the braking chain. Yeah, and that's the thing that even the wear on the chain is a little take-up on those handles. So they must have had some way of checking the chain, and they allowed for the swag in the chain and so on. They were very, very accurate, and even between those range lines, you know, they all right there. The measurements between those range lines was pretty doggone good because it fit all the way across. In Killington, the surveyor claimed that he found a mistake after he laid off his chainman, so he had to hire him back to correct his mistake. Now that was done in February and there was snow on the ground, and in some ways that wasn't a bad time of year to do Killington, because when he ran his cross lines, he could, you know, he could see his lines very clearly. But I've got a lot of respect for those range lines.
Oh, I do too, but like I'm saying, you know, sometimes we're not talking about accuracies of 100 feet, we're talking accuracies of a few feet.
Yeah.
When you're trying to put everything together on a USGS scale versus what's in the field, it makes a big difference.
Of course, the other thing is that in firing and fencing, if the landowner recognized the fences, that superseded the deeds.
Right.
A lot of people get confused about that. You know, they try to go back. I did one in Pomfret, and it was a lot line, a long one from Mrs. Higgins, and I could still pick up pieces of wire, but of course it's back and forth. So Mrs. Higgins suggested maybe we should reblaze the original line. So I went to the neighbor to talk about it, and the neighbor, no way, I'm going to leave things the way they are. But then he went on to say I was trying to steal his land. So you can't win sometimes. Yeah.
I think Bill had a question.
Gordon, how long is a chain? I missed that.
66 feet.
66.
And I have a story to tell about that too. Because I spent some time in court, and one case in particular, I was called in just as a friend of the court, and it was to explain, you know, how we researched and so on and so forth, and chains. And there was a pretty cocky surveyor there, and he was testifying, oh yeah, what the chain, you know, he knew exactly what it was, and that was that. Well, I'm over in Shrewsbury, and I went in Pierce's old store, and on the back of the store, there was a shelf laying there, and I'm looking at it, and here's a chain there. Well worn, kind of rusty, so I wanted to buy it. No way, it came with the store, it's going to go with the store. I picked up the handle and looked at it, and it said 50 feet. The gunner chain is 66 feet. This chain is well worn, it's 50 feet. And so I spoke to Mr. Pierce about it. No, I really would like this chain. No, came to the store, it's going to go. He says, you know, that was an engineer's chain. But you know, most of the surveyors, when I first started in, were the engineers. The question is, if you're working in Shrewsbury, that area, and they're talking about chains, are they talking about the gunner chain or the engineer chain? and side by side, they look so much alike, you can't tell without taking a pretty close look at them, you know. They both had 100 links.
What was the access to this farm? Do you have any idea what the order
Well, you
of
see,
roads is? There's an old road here, and Peter Thompson, who's a member here, tried to find a road, an old road here that actually ended up down on their farm. Like there's two roads from here to there.
Well,
I guess one.
don't get road and highway confused.
Okay, I am.
Because that's what's really feathering the lawyers' pocketbooks today, is the confusion between the road and the highway. Road and the highway are not the same thing. When this town was settled, Vermont was already had their laws about highways, and Before any new road could be built, there had to be a survey of the proposed location and a layout at a minimum 3 rods wide, and it had to be recorded. Now, there are a lot of farm roads built from here to there, and a lot of those roads are held up, and as a matter of fact, the towns are even maintaining some of these roads that never were legal highways. Unfortunately, I didn't get onto that until fairly late when they were doing the ancient roads studies. The instructions for that were not good. Those committees should have been looking for the highways, which are still there. The town has no authority to deed away that public land. So a road may be built within the limits of the highway, and then it may be abandoned. The road may be discontinued or abandoned. The highway is still there. In Bridgewater, those highways are so clear. You know, you can see these stone walls and the fences. All of the early roads in Bridgewater are built according to the law, and then the public roads. But there are a lot of little private farm roads that go from here to there, you know, to catch the neighbors and so on and so forth. As far as that town highway, we get a little bit of a clue here as to when it was done, because when they deeded over to that 5 acres, they did that to make up for the highway they had taken, that 3-rod strip that they had taken. These other lots, like the one, the south one there that the highway goes through, you could compute the amount of acreage taken, but there were 5 acres allowed there, and that road didn't take up anywhere near all of the 5 acres. So that title still has a cloud on it. Your land has a cloud on it.
Well, thank you, Gordon. That was great. Any more questions?